Bob is the Professor of Geophysics in the Department of Earth Sciences at Cambridge University, and he's also the Director of the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion, the organisation that has organised this conference. I'm a geologist by training, so I do actually understand a little bit of what Bob does, and his research group uses information from either man-made or artificial earthquakes to tell us about the hidden structure of the earth beneath us, which otherwise we can't see. And he's done a lot of different and very interesting things over the years, but at the moment he's working on volcanic activity in Iceland and using the insights from geophysics, from seismic movements and measurements, to tell us about how melt is moving underneath a volcano. And you can see how that naturally leads into thinking about hazard and about risk, volcano risk, earthquake risk, and then as a Christian, reflecting on that from a Christian point of view. Bob's written a lot of interesting things, both scientifically and as a Christian response. And one particular book I'd bring to your attention, which is on the bookstall, Who is to Blame? Which is a book that came out in 2014. Also, you'll see in your pack another book which Bob has edited, which is a series of essays which relate to creation in crisis and a series of essays on sustainability. But tonight, Bob's just going to tell us a bit about the project which has given rise to this conference and then speak to us on his theme of disasters, natural or unnatural. And with that, I'll hand over to you, Bob.
Thank you, Hugh, and thank you for coming, everybody, on a Friday night. I hope my voice holds out. It's a bit croaky at the moment, but hopefully it will. As Hugh said, I'm a scientist, and I work on earthquakes and volcanoes, so disasters, really, in many ways. But I'm also a Christian, and most of what I'll talk about today will be from a Christian perspective. And obviously it's a big question as to how these big things, which can kill hundreds of thousands of people, can be related to our faith in a loving, sovereign God. And that's what we want to talk about through the weekend. The project he's talking about was actually done mostly by Roger over here, whom you'll hear from tomorrow, Roger Abbott, with some people he'd worked from who are here. And that was to look at how Christian faith might affect your response to disasters, or the way you're resilient to them or not, and whether it destroys your faith or enhances it. And I'm not going to give his talk for him, so he's going to tell us about that tomorrow. But he's worked in Haiti, which of course is an area that suffered hugely from all sorts of natural things, disasters, including typhoons and earthquakes, most notably. And he's worked in New Orleans, which you'll remember got flooded in 12 years ago now, I think it is. And we've got people from both Haiti and New Orleans here, so we're very grateful for that. And he's also worked in the Somerset Levels of England, where we have our own mini-floods, which nevertheless impact people very significantly, as well as in the Philippines, where Typhoon Yolanda came to land, the biggest, strongest typhoon in human history, as far as we know. So, done a lot of interesting things, and we'll hear about that later. But I want to talk about disasters, natural or unnatural. And you might have noticed in that book, I don't talk about natural, the title is not Natural Disasters, because I think the processes, and what I'm going to tell you is the processes which make this earth a fruitful, fertile place to live, the natural processes, are the same ones that can turn into disasters, but it's often human agency which causes that. And that's what I want to just draw out a bit. So I'm going to mostly talk about the science. So this piece of graffiti, which was written on a wall in 1994 after an earthquake in California, just sums it up in a way. First the earthquake, then the disaster, this wag had written. And there's a lot in that, as we'll draw out. The other thing I want to say is that in a group this size, there will be people who are suffering, and really severe suffering, or have suffered. There are people who have been through suffering, I mean certainly people who have been through disasters in that way. And what we're doing tonight, in a way, is what I call armchair theology, if you like. It's thinking about these issues in the comfort of a beautiful Cambridge college. It's not wheelchair theology, not what you do when somebody is in the midst of suffering. And we're going to hear from people that have been in these positions, and they know far more about it than I do. But these are a couple of books I've found very helpful, if you want to look them up. One is by Don Carson, How Long, O Lord, which is a scriptural analysis of suffering, really. The other one is a little book which you can read in just an hour by Nicholas Walterstorff, called Lament for a Son. Now, he's a philosopher-theologian in California, and his son in his 20s was killed in a skiing accident in the Alps. And you would think that, somebody who's a philosopher, theologian, would know all the answers. And of course he doesn't. It hits him as hard as anybody. And this is just a very honest talking through, day by day, he wrote a paragraph about what he was going through. And I found it really helpful. I know a lot of other people have as well. So I can recommend that just for somebody's perspective on these things. I know one of the things he says, for instance, is that often we don't know what to say to people that have just suffered some catastrophe, and we cross the street, don't we, to avoid talking to them. It's a very common reaction. And actually what he says is, over there you're no use to me. What I need you to do is to just be alongside me. Just there. Doesn't matter if you don't say anything. Just to know that you're with me. And I think that also is a very scriptural analysis. As Paul said, the Apostle Paul, writing to the Romans, he said, rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. And often that is the best thing we can do. So tonight, though, we're going to do something like armchair theology, not that wheelchair theology. And what I'm going to talk about is first the scientific issues of what causes disasters, what the background of them is and why they happen. And then I thought, rather than talk about the theology of it, which I do sometimes, because there's some theologians coming, some very good ones, who are going to talk about the relationship between God the Creator and his creation and us his creatures. Jonathan Moo's one of them, Christopher Asher's another. I thought I'd just talk us through some of the disasters which are recorded in the Bible, what we call natural disasters. Because clearly the biblical writers really knew what they were talking about, because they experienced famines, on a yearly basis. They experienced earthquakes and so on as well. So when they talk about it, I think they're talking from experience, and it's powerful to listen to them. The other thing is that I know some here will have seen a lot of death, but many in our culture do not see death. We don't even see dead people. And we don't even talk about people dying. We say they've passed away or they've moved on. We use euphemisms. Now, it just so happens that my father died 4 years ago, and I was with him when he died. So I've seen 2 people die, and my father-in-law died on the same day, almost 4 years later, just on Sunday gone. And so it is a privilege to be with people who die, especially, when they're Christian believers, which those 2 were. But let me talk about scientific issues first. The thing I want to say, really, is that the things we think of as disasters are what actually make this world a fruitful place to live. We're going to hear more about volcanoes from Amy Donovan tomorrow, or the day after, I forget, tomorrow. But this is a picture of Hawaii, which is one of the most biodiverse areas on Earth. And it's entirely volcanic. It's just a volcanic island. Volcanoes recycle nutrients from deep in the Earth to the surface, which we need to build our bodies. Volcanoes are good in that respect. In fact, if it weren't for them, there wouldn't be the life there is here now. I work on volcanoes, so I'm going to show you my holiday snaps. This is where I was a few months ago in the Western Pacific. This volcano has been erupting continuously for 8 years now, I think, very explosively, Mount Yasser, Vanuatu. And yet people live right at the foot of it. This is just a kilometre away from the foot because it's very fertile, and you can see that here. They're still living in mud huts, by and large, in this area at least. But one of the interesting things I wanted to point out, you'll just notice a little red sign that says mobile phone Digicel top up here. And it's one of the great things about technology that you can actually, they've jumped the technology from having copper wires to their landlines straight into mobile phones. And, you can charge them up on a solar panel, especially when you live near the equator. So that's just one of the good things about technology, one of the good things about science. But they live right on a volcano. They live upwind, not downwind, and the trade winds are very consistent there, so it's very safe there. This volcano is one in Iceland, which erupted in July 2010. Well, it erupted in April 2010, called Eyjafjallajökull. And some of you might remember it because it stopped 100,000 flights. And anybody have extended holidays somewhere nice because they couldn't get home? No, lots of people do. But I show this because this stuff in the background is ash from that volcano. This is at the foot of Eyjafjallajökull. There was about a foot of ash there. And within 2 months, this was 2 months later, these flowers were blooming and blossoming right through it. It is very fertile stuff. But lots of people had flights cancelled. You might think that there's not much good you can say about earthquakes. And indeed, earthquakes are difficult natural hazards because they happen without warning. We sort of know where to expect them to happen. You know, if you live on the San Andreas Fault, there is going to be an earthquake there quite soon, probably, because they happen about every 100 years. The last one, which flattens San Francisco, is 1906, so it's a bit overdue. What's good about earthquakes, you might say? Well, what's good about them is that if you're going to build a mountain belt, and this is the Himalayas here, that's done by pushing rocks up, and you get earthquakes doing that. You might not know, but the very top of Everest, if you go there and take a rock sample, which is not a trivial thing to do, but if you did, the rocks actually come from deep under the Indian Ocean, from about 4 kilometres depth under the seabed. So some of the deepest rocks on Earth are now at the top of the highest mountain. And that's because they've been pushed up through earthquakes. And it's the dynamic Earth and plate tectonics. Earthquakes are a consequence of that. The Himalayas provide water for 1 billion people on peninsular India. And mountains get eroded off by the rain. And it's that erosion which carries the products of it down into the river valleys, makes soil, and that soil is the place where we grow our crops. If it weren't for the mountains and the erosion and the soil, we wouldn't have all the crops and the ability to grow food that we have in river valleys. So the earthquakes are necessary in that cycle, if you like. And if the Earth didn't have plate tectonics, which is continually recycling nutrients and so on, it would be a sterile place, and there would be no life on it. Floods actually are the most mundane of things, you would think, but actually they're the disaster that kills most people by far. They're the most dangerous disaster on Earth. And they even kill people in Britain. Every year there's 1 or 2 people die in floods, partly because they build their houses on floodplains, and actually if you think about it, the sort of name gives it away slightly, doesn't it? You shouldn't really build a house on a floodplain and then complain when it gets flooded, but nevertheless that's what happens. This is a picture of Egypt from a satellite, and it's just to make the point that the fertile Nile, where all those crops are grown, depends entirely on the River Nile. And certainly in old days, it depended on the floods to carry silt over the riverbanks and make those fertile fields. And when the floods failed, there will be famine the next year. So floods, we'll talk about a bit more. The last thing I want to talk about, really, is to say something about climate change. Now, this is an animation from a decade ago, but it's still the same today. It's just the colours would be brighter colours than they are here. The reds are showing the concentration of carbon dioxide. The blacks in the southern hemisphere here is concentration of carbon monoxide. Both pretty bad greenhouse gases and bad for you. And the point I want to make really, and which this makes so clearly, is that we might think sitting here in Cambridge, well, what I do with the greenhouse gases of driving my car or whatever, you know, it's not very significant in the scheme of things. But actually what we do here carries right around the world. That's the point I want to make, really. And the consequences of our actions are felt by people on the other side of the world, often much poorer than us, with much less ability to cope with it or mitigate against it or adapt to it. And so I think climate change is one of the very big issues. Some people think it's the biggest issue facing us today. And as I'll show you, in terms of disasters, what it does is It doesn't necessarily make more storms, but it does make the storms more extreme when they happen. It makes the droughts more extreme when they happen. And, you know, if you're living in a subsistence economy and the crops fail 1 year, you might survive. If they fail 2 years or 3 years, you're really in trouble. So that's the point of this diagram, really, just to show that consequences of our actions are felt everywhere around the world. And there are deeply significant moral issues and ethical issues, I think, surrounding that, aren't there? And I think it's one that religious people really are conscious of often. Well, we'll stop that in August. It would switch the other way if we carried on. I'm going to just show you a few pictures of the world now. This is the world as we know and love it on a Mercator projection. Of course, actually, that's distorted, but it's the way we think the world looks because we're so used to it. But I am going to distort it now with various things. So one of the things I'm going to distort it with is where people live who are killed by disasters. And you can see they live disproportionately in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. Let's look at where people live who are killed by droughts. That's largely in Africa. People who are killed by floods. Southeast Asia, also South America. You see the really rich countries, see Europe and North America, hardly affected by these things. Killed in earthquakes, again, Southeast Asia dominantly, South America somewhat. North America has very big earthquakes, very, very big ones. One of the biggest in the world, probably ever, was off Vancouver, maybe magnitude 10, which we've not seen the like of. But people don't die there because they build buildings. They're rich enough to build buildings that don't fall down. And then this is coming back to what I was just saying about that carbon production, that the countries that have grown rich by burning carbon, Britain is one of them through the Industrial Revolution and since then, and North America, and the whole of Europe generally, are the ones that have got rich. The poor countries, who are largely the ones, as I showed you just now, are suffering from disasters, didn't feel much of that increased wealth. And so this is where the moral issue comes in, isn't it? And that's related to this map here of people living in poverty on less than $2 a day. Again, it almost maps exactly onto the areas that experience disasters. Because the fact is, if you're rich, you can buy your way out of these things. If you live in the Netherlands, below sea level, you just build a bigger dike. If you live in London, you build the Thames Barrier. But if you live in Bangladesh, where 30 million people live within 1 metre of sea level, you can't build a barrier. Partly you haven't got the money, and partly it's a deltaic region anyway. So there are interesting issues there. Let me talk about some specific eruptions and disasters that have followed them then. But again, I'm going to show you my holiday snaps. This is an eruption in 2014 in Iceland, which turned out to be the biggest for 250 years. It was first discovered by my students, actually, working out there, right in the middle of Iceland. And this is a picture I took on my iPhone, actually. So this is fire fountaining. It's 100 metres high, and these are lumps of molten rock flying out. The brown stuff is sulfur dioxide. And the point of putting it up, apart from I like the pictures, is that this is awesome in its power, awesome in the proper meaning of the word. So the energy in this is equivalent to a Hiroshima-sized bomb, atomic bomb going off. Not just once, not twice, but every 2 minutes for 6 months. It's a huge amount of energy. The sulfur dioxide that's coming out is more from this one little eruption than the whole of the European Union produced in a year. So there's a huge amount of energy involved in this, and this is just one of them. Earthquakes, of course, have a huge amount of energy as well. Well, in the biggest eruption before this one I've just shown you was in 1783 in Iceland, and so many gases were produced, noxic volcanic gases, that it caused a haze everywhere. A haze actually which extended over northwest Europe down to Paris. Benjamin Franklin was the US ambassador in Paris at the time, and he wrote about it. He wrote an article on this unusually cold summer they were having in Paris due to this haze. Well, what happened as a result of this eruption, and actually this isn't a photo of that particular eruption, I have to say, it's another one from Krapler. But 50 farms were overrun, but lava flows quite slowly. It flows a few meters a minute, and you can move out the way. So it overran 50 farms, but nobody was killed in the eruption. But these nasty gases it produced actually polluted the grass that the livestock were eating. We know now mostly with fluorine, so they got fluorine poisoning. And the next winter, 76% of the horses died, half the cows, and 80% of the sheep, which is what they relied on. This is a subsistence economy. And you're going to guess what happened next. A quarter of the humans died of starvation as an indirect result of that volcanic eruption. Now, the interesting story behind this is that Iceland was a vassal state of Denmark at the time, and all of their commerce was controlled by Denmark. Denmark would send a ship once a year, which would bring manufactured goods and so on, and they would trade them for the stuff that the Icelanders made, which is much the same as they still make today. It's fish, mostly, and wool. So they do this trade, and it was governed and strongly controlled by the Danish, so nobody else was allowed in to trade with them. And as I said, they knew that there was this nasty stuff going on in Iceland because Benjamin Franklin was writing scientific papers about it. And all they had to do was send a ship with some food in, and they didn't. And that's why people starved. They could easily have sent some food. And that's a very contemporary issue, isn't it? I mean, there are people starving today in the world, and yet there's an almost equal number of people who are grossly unwell because they're overweight. They're clinically obese. Well, that was one eruption, which was a fairly gentle one, and we can predict eruptions like that, so they are fairly safe these days. And that's one of the things I work on how to predict them. And I'm sure that Amy will talk more about this. One of the worst ones in recorded history was on Ascension Day 1902 in Martinique. This is a small volcanic island in the west. And it had been active for some months, and people were wanting to leave. The mountain was called Pelée, and actually the mayor, or the governor rather, didn't want people to leave because there were elections due, and a particular demographic of people in the Saint-Pierre, which was the biggest commercial city on the island, would have favoured him. And so actually he stopped people leaving, even though it was obvious. You know, a lot of livestock and a few people had already been killed by eruptions that had started. In fact, he stopped people leaving by posting armed guards on the paths to turn them back. And he did what everybody in government does when they want to get their own way. He set up a commission, and he staffed it with his own people. So he set up this commission on the 5th of May 1902, and they reported that there is nothing in the activity of Pelée, that's the volcano, that warrants a departure from Saint-Pierre. There was no scientist on it except for the local school teacher who wasn't a scientist. Well, that was the 5th of May. On the 8th of May, there was this massive eruption which sent burning gas, it's called nuée ardente, rolling down the hillside. It rolls down the valley, so it rolled down the valley that Saint-Pierre was built in. And basically it's at about 800 degrees C, it goes at about 50 or 100 miles an hour, and it burns up the oxygen, and you're either suffocated or burnt to death. And everybody in the city was killed, between 26,000 and 36,000 people, including the governor. There were some ships in the harbour, and this is an eyewitness report from one of them. Even on his ship, there were only 25 survivors out of 68, and he must have been on the side away from this burning gases coming down. He said the side of the volcano was ripped out, and there was hurled straight toward us a solid wall of flame. And after the explosion, not one living being was seen on land. And that's a picture of Saint-Pierre. So this was not that actual one because it wasn't photographed. This is a smaller one which happened afterwards, and you can just see how the cloud of gases just rolls downhill, and it sucks in oxygen and burns it up as you go down. Actually, it wasn't quite true that there were no survivors, because there was one survivor. There was this guy called Ludger Silbaris, who was a minor criminal And the previous night had been making a nuisance of himself, and they'd thrown him in the local jail. The local jail, it turns out, was an old Napoleonic store for explosives, which is there's a picture of it in the top left corner there. Because it was an explosive store, it had very, very thick walls, very small windows, and a very thick door. And so he survived by sticking his head in the slops bucket in his cell, and it rolled over him, and it rolls over so fast that if you survive for 2 or 3 minutes, then it's okay again. I mean, it did get, you can see his whole back is burned, but he survived. But the trouble was, he was still locked inside the cell, and there was nobody else alive. And actually, he was locked in there for 2 days, I think, before some tourists wandering around the ruins heard him crying for help. And they let him out, and they very magnanimously gave him a pardon. So there was one survivor. Well, I want to, that's volcanoes. Let me talk about earthquakes a little bit. Earthquakes are more tricky, and we're going to talk about Haiti later on, and there are people here from Haiti. But I want to compare 2 identical earthquakes. One of them occurred in Haiti. One of them occurred in this place called Loma Prieta in California in 1989, so this is now 30 years ago. It was a magnitude 7 earthquake, which was reasonably large. Technically, it was a strike-slip earthquake at 10 kilometers depth, and 57 people died in that earthquake. And they mainly died because this 2-story roadway collapsed and squashed cars between it. They were in the process of earthquake strengthening this road, and they hadn't got to this section. But what many will know is that on the 12th of January 2010, there was a magnitude 7 earthquake in Haiti when 230,000 people died. And it was an identical earthquake, strike-slip earthquake, 10 kilometers depth. Now, we'll maybe discuss later the reasons for this, but amongst them, clearly, are people who died in these sort of slum areas because they just slid down the landslide. And they weren't living there from choice, really. Buildings weren't well made, and they're built there because of endemic corruption by the rulers. And actually colonial arrogance, too, by the French, who owned this part of Haiti. And when the indigenous people took it back to themselves, the French insisted that they get interest payments paid to them because of that, because they thought they were owed it. And they were still taking interest payments just before the earthquake, at the time of the earthquake, from Haiti, which is one of the poorest nations in the Western Hemisphere. So you have to say there's something going wrong there. There's human agency there, isn't there? I mean, whose fault is this? Is this God's fault that 230,000 people died? Or is it human agency? Now, of course, it's not necessarily the fault of the people who lived in those buildings that collapsed. But there is human agency involved. And as I say, this fault was well known. There's been scientific papers written on it just a couple of years before. And I want to show you this picture, which is of 2 brand new buildings which were built just a year before the earthquake. One again is actually, it's the same Digicel Communications as we saw in Vanuatu. 13-story mobile phone company headquarters. Probably the only 13-story building, I should think, isn't it, in Haiti? And it has plate glass windows, and not a single plate glass window was cracked in the earthquake. It was built by American contractors. In the foreground is a hospital built at the same time, originally a 4-story hospital which collapsed and killed many people. Now, it's not that we don't know how to build buildings that don't fall down. There's just lots of reasons to do with poverty and corruption and all sorts of other things as to why we don't build buildings that don't fall down. So again, there's an issue here of justice and ethics, isn't there? And this is the paper I said, which was published just 2 years before. You see the date on it, 2008, written by people I know. And they were talking about this Enriquillo fault, which is the one that slipped. It's the one in the south here, which had broken repeatedly before, including in 1751. There was a big one there, 1770, 1860, and then 2010. And what they wrote in this paper before the earthquake was, with its last major event in 1751, the Enriquillo fault in Haiti is capable of a magnitude 7.2 event today. The Enriquillo fault has not been investigated in detail, they said. So, even this fault was known about. and that's the actual one that broke. And in fact, it hasn't released all the energy. There's more to come. The last thing I want to show you is from an earthquake in Japan. This is actually the biggest one in the last 100 years, probably, magnitude 9.5. Happened in 2011. This is the one that flooded the Fukushima nuclear power plant. And this is Tokyo. And if you look carefully at those buildings, you'll see them swaying to and fro. Actually, quite a few meters. Can you see that in the skyscrapers? And if I got the sound on, you'd hear people saying, this was taken on somebody's mobile phone, oh, isn't that interesting? Look how those buildings are swaying. This is in the middle of an earthquake, which was 10,000 times bigger in energy than the one in Haiti. And it was 10 times bigger than the maximum they'd expected in Tokyo. And yet, you can build buildings that don't fall down. You just build them the same sort of way as you build airplane wings. You know, have you ever sat on an airplane and looked down the wing as it takes off, how much it changes? You just build them to flex. And as far as I know, nobody died in Tokyo in this earthquake because of human ingenuity, if you like, technology, and of course, the wealth to be able to do it. Well, let me move on to floods, which, as I said before, are one of the world's main killers. And quite a few of us here were alive in 1970, and some will have seen this picture before because I've shown it before. What probably most of us don't know is that on the 12th of November 1970, a cyclone hit Bangladesh. At the time it was called East Pakistan because it was just after partition. And that one single night from that flood, more than 500,000 people died in the floods. And again, it was largely unnecessary because this cyclone had been tracked for 5 days before it hit land. Largely by the Indians, but the Indians were fighting a war with the Pakistanis after partition, so they didn't really tell them. So they didn't get a warning of it. And so it was flooded. In 2007, there was another one where only 3,000 people died. It was an almost identical cyclone, followed the same track. And people, you might say 99.8% of those deaths were saved because they'd done some very simple things. They'd built cyclone shelters, like the ones shown here, which acted like schools and community centres during the weekday. And the other thing was, the critical thing was, they gave a mobile phone to every village headman, right? So that when they knew it was coming, they just phone them up saying, there's a cyclone coming, you know, go up in the building, move away from the coast, which is what they did. And the other thing they did was they replanted mangrove swamps. A lot of mangrove swamps have been torn up, and actually they break the force of tidal waves. So very simple, low technology solutions actually can save hundreds of thousands of lives. And that is still the case today, actually. Just where earthquakes are concerned, just changing the roofs that people use, say in India, they often put thatch on and put big stones on to hold the thatch down. And when it's an earthquake, it falls on top of you and kills you. Just changing that for plastic sheeting, if you like, or plastic corrugated covering or something like that, which won't kill you when it falls off, is a very low-cost solution and very doable. But floods have killed a lot of people. China repeatedly, maybe up to 4 million people, died in floods of the Yellow River in the 30s. And floods affect, in the last century, 100 million people a year. And they're actually affecting more people every year. You might think it's strange, but it's because population is growing exponentially and people live in cities. More people now live in cities than they do in rural areas. It's crossed that threshold. And cities nearly always in river valleys or by the coast because that's where communications are good. And so it's reckoned that in a few years' time, half the world's population will be at risk from storms. And we see this, don't we? We even see it in England in the Somerset Levels. We see it on the east coast of the US. We certainly see it in the Caribbean islands every year. So floods do affect a lot of people. And something else we'll talk about later, which I'm not going to talk about in detail now, is the Katrina hurricane, which hit New Orleans. And although it's the richest nation in the world, and this was well tracked, and it knew it was coming, and there were evacuation orders given, still 1,300 people died, which is terrible, really. And we'll hear more, won't we, from you about this and how to cope with it. But the people who died were largely the poorer people who lived in the worst areas, which were below sea level. because the evacuation plans called for you to get into your car and drive north away from the coast, which is pretty simple to do if you've got a car. If you don't have a car, you're stuck, aren't you? Or if you're elderly or infirm. So actually, it's again, this ethical issue comes up, and the people who suffer are often the most disempowered, if you like. Now, sitting in this room, we are the powerful, rich people. So there is a strong ethical issue for us to face, I think. I'll only show one quote from about New Orleans, because we'll hear more about it later. But this was a report by a secular body, the university, afterwards. You remember that what happened was the levees failed on the river was above the land, and so the water flooded in. What they said was failure of the New Orleans flood defense system was a predictable, predicted, and preventable catastrophe. It did not result from an act of God, it resulted from acts of people. So you're probably getting the message. I keep saying the same thing, don't I, really? But nevertheless, it is true. One of the interesting counter things to this is, do you remember the Boxing Day tsunami, 2004? One thing I always do on holidays is switch off my work computer. Partly because my wife insists on it, but actually I'm quite glad to anyway. But I have to say that on Boxing Day 2004, I did switch it on, because I heard about this big earthquake, and the first report always says, 10 people have been killed, or 15, I think it's 30, and then 50, and then suddenly it's 200,000. Now, the only reason I'm putting it up, actually, mostly, is because there's a little island called Simalou, which was only a matter of tens of kilometres from the epicenter, from where the earthquake started. It was an offshore island, people didn't go there much, and actually the rescuers didn't bother going there for a week, because they thought for sure they're going to have had it there, because they're so close, so they concentrated on the mainland where they were. When they actually drove up there, they found, yes, the tsunami had wiped the villages clean, it flattened them. There'd been a huge tsunami wave, it had gone up 30 to 40 meters, so this is over 100 foot run up. But actually, everybody was still alive, perfectly happy. I mean, they weren't all that happy because their houses had been destroyed, but they had fires lit, they were cooking their lunch. And they said, how come you survived this? Because the tsunami would hit immediately, because you're so close, you'd really get no warning. And this is really interesting. What they said was, our grandparents told us about this thing in 1940s. There was a tsunami in 1940s that happened there. And what always happens with tsunamis is the water goes out first, and then it comes back in a big wave later. And there's often 10, 15, 20 minutes between these, so you have time to get away. All you have to do is go high enough up so that you're higher than the wave. And they said, our grannies told us about this. They said, if you ever see the water go out, go the other way, quick. And that's what they did. And they were all fine. And I think one of the issues is that so many of us live in places which are completely divorced from the natural world on which we depend, that we've lost that folk knowledge. And certainly, of course, in a lot of tourists were killed and a lot of people that have moved into that area. But these indigenous people knew full well. And I think there's a big lesson there, isn't there? I mean, a lot of people today have no idea where their food comes from. My wife was a primary school teacher, and one of the things they did was grow. They had a little garden, they grew vegetables, and they'd bring them in and teach the kids about it. Actually, these were preschool kids, they're very little. And one year, they'd grown some peas, and they brought the peas in and opened up the pods and said, try it. I remember as a kid, I used to eat peas out of the pod, and they're so fresh and sweet. And, half the children said, yeah, not eating that, that's not where peas come from. They come from a packet that's in the freezer. And they're certainly not in their pods anymore. And I think that's just symptomatic of the fact we've got divorced from the world in which we live, the natural environment in which we live, sometimes to our detriment. And in this case, it saved their lives. Famines, almost always, are a result of human agency. And I was giving some talks a couple of weeks ago in Ireland, so I looked into the Irish potato famine. Some of you might know about that. Happened in late 1840s, because the potato got a particular blight, and that was their staple food. and 1 million people died in that famine. And actually, something like 2 million people were forced to emigrate, and this was a political thing, really, because the landowners had tenant farmers, and they used the excuse that they couldn't pay their rent that year to actually force them off the land, and a lot of them went to North America. So it's sort of like the Highland clearances in Scotland, where people were forced out so that the landowners could get the land back. That's sort of by the by. The interesting thing is that, of course, it's right next door to England, and there was tons of food in England. There's no reason why 1 million people should starve to death just the other side of the Irish Sea. And the minister in charge was somebody called Trevelyan. He was a Whig minister in the government. He was put in charge of the Irish crisis. And he didn't send food. Now, what I'm going to read next will sound absolutely shocking to you, but, I mean, this was the culture of the time. And this is what he said. He saw the famine as a mechanism for reducing surplus population. He said, the judgment of God, and this is published, I mean, this is what he was quite pleased to publish it. The judgment of God sent the calamity to teach the Irish a lesson. That calamity must not be too much mitigated. The real evil with which we have to contend is not the physical evil of the famine, but the moral evil of the selfish, perverse, and turbulent character of the people. I mean, it's just appalling to I don't know how I can read it out cold like that, really. But actually, you'll hear the same thing today when there's a big disaster. You know, those people died in a tsunami because they were particularly sinful, or they were homosexuals, or they were Muslims, or they were whatever your pet hate, you know, your pet gripe is. You say, well, that's their fault. And we often hear that one way or another, sometimes not very subtle, sometimes more subtle. Well, it must be their fault. Well, certainly the Bible has a lot to say about the fact that there isn't this one-to-one connection. Now, Trevelyan actually did go on and work in India, and he did a better job there because he averted a famine there. But there's 2 other famines that have come to light in more recent times, which are even worse, really, because they were politically motivated. Poor old Ukraine in the 30s, something like between 3 and 5 million people died because of Stalin's rural collectivization policies. And with the opening up of China, it's become clear that between 20 and 40 million people died as a result of Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward. Now, his idea was to send people out and grow grain in the rural areas. And what's I mean, really terrible behind this statistic is that there was actually a lot of grain in China at the time these people were dying of starvation. And what Mao Zedong was doing, he was selling it to the Soviet Union, I mean, partly to get foreign currency for buying arms, but partly to sort of big himself up in the communist era. He was this great communist leader. He could even send grain to the Soviet Union, and yet his own people died. So, I mean, this is rampantly obvious. This is not an act of God. This is an act of people. And in fact, in these cases, we know which people it was. Famines nearly always are a result of injustice like that, even today. And as I said, there are people dying today. Now, at dinner, we were just talking about the Lisbon earthquake, and I won't say much about it, but it is worth saying that this happened in 1755. It was All Saints' Day. It was a Saturday, 1st of November 1755. Lisbon was the most prosperous European city in existence at the time, mostly because it was getting a lot of gold from South America and so on. A lot of rich merchants there. And there was a big earthquake. It was early in the morning, early morning-ish. People were in church, lots of candles. People were cooking a lot of stuff for a feast day. And when the earthquake happened, a lot of buildings fell down and a lot of fires started. So poor old Lisbon people suffered earthquake and fire. And if they weren't killed in one, a lot were killed in another one. It was the worst disaster in Europe ever, actually, even up to the present day, from natural causes. And then what happened about 2 hours later was people rushed down to the coast, to the River Tagus, which was the port, to get away from the fires and falling masonry. And there was a tsunami, a tidal wave. In fact, there were 3 tidal waves came in and a lot more were drowned. So poor old people had earthquake, fire and flood, you know, all in the space of a few hours. And this was just the beginning of the Enlightenment. This was just the era when people had said, aren't we clever scientifically? We're going to control the world. We're going to move away from all this superstitious religion. And then suddenly something like this happens and hits them from left field, and lots of people die, and it's something I had no control over whatsoever. And actually, you know, similar things happen today. There's a big earthquake. My colleagues who are seismologists reckon there will be an earthquake in our lifetimes that will kill 1 million people. I'll just say that again. There'll probably be an earthquake in our lifetimes that kills 1 million people, despite our technological expertise and our know-how. I'll tell you where it's likely to be. It's likely to be somewhere like Delhi or Tehran, because Tehran is flattened by earthquakes every 100 years. And in the past, it was a camel trading post. There hasn't been one for quite a while now, but now there's 20 million people in Tehran in the working day. The buildings aren't built to survive earthquakes, so it's quite likely that would be a very dangerous place to be. I know when I go to a place, even if I go to somewhere like San Francisco, some people love to stay in bourgeois hotels, always stay in the most anodyne, concrete, recently built hotel, because they know how to build and they don't fall down. So that's my advice to you. Stay in horrible concrete blocks, they're much safer. Well, they're much safer in North America. They're probably not much safer in Haiti, though, or other places, or certainly not in Africa, where I've been, in Ethiopia, where they're putting up concrete blocks without tying them together properly. Anyway, this gave rise to a big debate, which we might talk about. I'm not going to talk about, but between people like Voltaire and Rousseau and Leibniz, talking about how could a good God allow such terrible suffering. But an interesting comment was written by John Wesley. They used to write pamphlets a lot in those days. So these were his serious thoughts occasioned by the late earthquake in Lisbon. And what he said was this, which I think is really interesting. He said, what is nature itself but the art of God, or God's method of acting in the material world? In other words, what he was saying was, you can't say, well, that earthquake was just nature, so that's nothing to do with God. Because if we believe in a sovereign God who has sovereignty over the whole world, in a creator God who created this world, who's immanent in it, then nature is the way that God works. And you can't let God off the hook by saying it's nature. That's a very sort of deist view of it. In fact, the same thing has been said a long time before by Augustine, as he said many good things in the 4th century. He said more pithily as well, nature is what God does, or nature is what God is doing. The translation is from Latin, of course. So you don't let God off the hook by saying, well, that's just nature. You know, nature is God working in this world, and we have to take that. That is the world in which we live. Well, those are some of the scientific issues and some of the things that have happened. There's much more we could talk about. Rather than talk about theology, because other people are going to develop this relationship between God the Creator and his creation, I thought it'd be interesting just to look at some disasters in the Bible, because as I said, the Bible writers, the people who wrote Scripture, actually were very aware of life and death and disasters. They lived it face to face in a way that often we don't today, although some of us in this room have done. Mostly they talk about earthquakes, famines and floods, and they talk about them in 3 sorts of ways. So sometimes they just use some big event as a memorable event, which is a time marker. For those of you who are old enough, can you remember what you're doing when Nixon was assassinated? Gosh, can none of you remember? I can. How about 9/11? Can you remember what you're doing on 9/11? Yeah, so these big events, and these are world events which we all remember. And I'll show you an example of the Bible using an earthquake in that way. Sometimes they're just incidental to a story, the backdrop, framework on which it's written. So there was a big famine in Joseph's time, and that's what eventually led to the Israelite nation growing, starting in Egypt, and then the Exodus after that. Interesting little story about Ruth and Naomi, which I'll talk about as well. And sometimes earthquakes and so on are used as evidence of God's presence in the world, the fact that he's here. Sometimes God giving us up to the consequences of our own actions. So that's just a sort of framework for how they're used. So here's an example of that in Psalm 81. The psalmist reports God as declaring that my people would not listen to me, says God. Israel would not submit to me. So I gave them over to their stubborn hearts to follow their own devices. And that's quite a common sort of theme in the Bible, actually, that because God gives us freedom, we're not just puppets. He wants us to develop a relationship with him of free choice. But actually, if we make bad choices, consciously knowing they're bad choices, then we will suffer the consequences of them. And, you know, that's quite a common theme in the Bible. And I think it's good that that is the case, because if God intervened every time we're about to trip over, it would not be the sort of place we could live in, because things would happen at random. It is a repeatable, consistent world, actually, in which we can do science. I mean, I'm quite pleased because I can be a scientist, and because the world is like that. And actually, I take it as part of God's goodness to us that he's made a world like that, which is understandable by us and which we can use our understanding for the good of humankind. I mean, we can use it for bad things as well, but we can certainly use it for the good of humankind. And actually, that is why probably the world's first scientific society, the Royal Society, was set up in the early 17th century. In the charter given it by Charles II, he said, I'm setting up this society for the glory of God and the good of humankind, so that by understanding natural processes you can do good for humans. And of course science has done huge amounts of good for scientists. So we live in a world where we suffer the consequences of our actions, and the Bible's clear on that. And the way we respond to disasters is part of that. What about earthquakes? Well, in the Bible there's something like 20 explicit references to earthquakes. There's many more references to the earth shaking, which are clearly to do with earthquakes. And here's an example of earthquakes that have happened before 1900. So this is before we had instruments. And there's a very good scholar who actually can read about 10 different ancient languages, including Persian and Hebrew and Greek and all kinds of stuff. Sanskrit as well, actually, I think. And he went through a lot of reports of earthquakes and worked out where they were. You can sort of tell where they are by how much damage is associated with them, because the damage decreases as you get further away. Here's a map of those earthquakes, and it's very consistent with what we see today, so I'm sure it's right. These are all bigger than magnitude 6.5, so they're quite big earthquakes. And some cities, which are talked about in the Bible, have been repeatedly destroyed. So Philippi, Corinth, Antioch and Jerusalem and Jericho have all been destroyed by earthquakes frequently. Because of the very, the theatre in which the Bible is played out, it's a very active area. And there was one particular earthquake, we know exactly when it was 759 BC, near Jerusalem. And we know it was a magnitude 7.3 earthquake. It's reported by many people around at the time. And this is talked about in the Bible, in Amos. So the first verse of Amos, he says, these are the words of Amos, one of the shepherds of Tekoa. This is a vision he saw concerning Israel 2 years before the earthquake, when Uzziah was king of Judah and Jeroboam, son of Jehoash, was king of Israel. So, we can date this exactly. We can find it scientifically. And here he is using it like 9/11. This was 2 years before 9/11. This is what I learned. And then he writes it down and follows it. So here's an earthquake being used just because so many people in the whole area would have experienced it. So they knew exactly what he's talking about. They knew when he was talking about it. So that's one. And in fact, this earthquake is still being talked about 200 years later. If you look at Zechariah, which is talking about the end times, on that day you will flee as you fled from the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah, says Zechariah. Then the Lord my God will come and all the holy ones with him. So this was just a memorable event which is stuck in people's memory, and he's just using that as a marker, really. So Corinth actually has been destroyed many times, most recently in 1858, and then he moved the city down to where Corinth is now on the coast, which is why you can still go and stand where Paul stood and preached. There's a little plaque there, if you go there. Antioch's been destroyed at least 15 times in the last 2,500 years. 859 AD, there was a magnitude 8 earthquake there, which flattened Antioch. Jericho has suffered, well, there's 17 destruction layers even in the pre-Christian era. Maybe they're not all earthquakes, but a lot of them are. And we know there were 5 earthquakes recorded historically in the 7th to 9th centuries. There were 4 in the 11th century. Even as recently as 1927, there was a magnitude 6.2 that killed 285 people. So Jericho's suffered many earthquakes. And I think one of the most notable places where an earthquake plays an integral part to the story was in Philippi. You remember that Paul was in prison there. And about midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, he wrote. the other prisoners were listening to them. And suddenly there was such a violent earthquake that the door burst open and they could actually just get out. Their chains came free, so they could escape. And you might remember that at that point, the jailer was about to kill himself, because if he's lost all his charges, that's really bad news. And that's when Paul says, don't harm yourself, we're all here. And actually, Paul didn't escape, he stayed after that earthquake. And you can read about it in Acts 16. And in fact, the jailer and all his family were converted as a result of that. So that's a story in the Bible that the earthquake was playing a central part in. One of the nice little backstories was at a place called Mishmash in 1025 BC, around about then, where Saul was chasing the Philistines. And there was one way through this valley which was well defended by the Philistines, and they were on the heights on each side. And so the Philistine army were there. Saul was camped to the south. And Jonathan and his armor-bearer, being young, impetuous men, decided to sneak out of the camp at night and climb up the cliffs and taunt the Philistines there, which they did. And when you read about it, what you find was that he climbed up this steep slope on his hands and feet with his armor-bearer, and actually he killed, they all fell before Jonathan, and his armor-bearer killed them after they'd fallen over, and they killed about 20 men in an acre of land. Was no earthquake yet, but the earthquake comes next, because very shortly afterwards, we read, panic struck the whole Philistine army, those in the camp and field and those in the outposts and raiding parties, and the ground shook. It was a panic sent by God, says Samuel as he writes this. He clearly saw the earthquake as an integral part of this. And actually, when you read this whole passage, you see that the Philistines were in such panic, they were killing each other. And Saul's back in his camp saying, why has this happened? You better count the people, see if anyone's missing. And they finally find that Jonathan and his armor-bearer weren't there. Saul got a bit cross, but then they did go and slaughter all the Philistines and chase them out. Now, another interesting side story to this was in the last war, apparently I've read that General Allenby was operating in this area, and he was doing his morning Bible study, and he read about this, actually, and he was camped just near here. And he found that, there's a way round. We can go up those cliffs there and get round the back of them, and did that, apparently. And of course, one of the striking times where God's hand is seen was in the crucifixion in Matthew 27. You read, when the centurion and those with him who were guarding Jesus saw an earthquake, and of course Jesus dying, they were terrified and exclaimed, surely he was the Son of God. So the Bible it just weaves these earthquakes into the fabric of what's going on. Sometimes the timing of them is seen as God's hand. Sometimes it's seen as God actually doing something. Sometimes it's just incidental to the story. Volcanoes don't appear much, although actually you remember in the Exodus the Israelites followed a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. That was probably a volcano, though actually we don't know which one. People speculate about where it might be in the Sinai, but we don't actually know. And when Moses went up Mount Sinai, which we don't also know where that is really, to write the Ten Commandments, Deuteronomy reports that the mountain was ablaze with fire. It produced thunder and lightning, was covered with smoke and trembled violently. And all those things are characteristic of active volcanoes that are erupting. So it probably was a volcano. But often they're used in the Bible, as I said before, as an image of God's power in creation. So in Psalm 104 you'll read, for instance, may the glory of the Lord endure forever. May the Lord rejoice in his works. He who looks at the earth and it trembles. He who touches the mountains and they smoke. So here's earthquakes and volcanoes. And if God is sovereign, he's the creator God, then that's what you'd expect, isn't it? Floods in the Bible, well, of course, we know about Noah's flood. And Noah's flood is used primarily, really, to give a theological message. Although it is clear that there was some massive inundation which affected people in the area where the Bible was played out in a massive way, because it's recorded in the Gilgamesh epic from the 7th century BC, and in other places as well. There's a long folk history of a massive flood. So I'm sure there was some flood, which was massive over a big area. But the Bible uses it mainly to give a theological message, that God hated sin so much that he was wiping sin off the earth, except for the righteous Noah and his family who survived, and then he started afresh. And he uses a very similar picture, of course, for the new creation, that he's going to do a similar thing. He's going to wipe sin off the earth and then remake it in the way it's meant to be. And just common sense things, really, like in Luke, Jesus said, "The one who hears my words and does not put them into practice is like a man who built a house on the ground without a foundation. The moment the torrent struck that house, it collapsed and its destruction was complete." So this is just common sense things. He's talking about things to make a point that people would all have known about. Of course they knew if you didn't build your house properly, it would fall down or get washed away. Famines perhaps crop up most often in the Bible. Almost everybody would have been living subsistence lives. Almost everybody would have experienced shortage of food, if not actual famine, from time to time. Joseph, I'll just mention briefly, but there's others as well we'll come to in a minute. So you remember Joseph, after a long backstory where his brothers had tried to get rid of him and they'd sold him to some traders, he'd gone to Egypt, been thrown into prison, eventually interpreted the Pharaoh's dreams and said, well, there's going to be 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine, so it'd be a good idea to lay up a load of food for 7 years because then you'll survive the 7 years of famine. And he was such a good organizer that Pharaoh made him his right-hand man, and that's what he did. And when the famines did come, when there was shortage of food, then of course the surrounding areas all came into Egypt to get food. Now famines in Egypt were very common. This was not a once-off, the one at the time of Joseph. You read about all of Upper Egypt was dying of hunger and people were eating their children, it said in the first intermediate period. Even in the Bible, Abraham, in Genesis 12, we find Abraham went down to Egypt to escape famine in Canaan. In Genesis 26, Isaac was affected by famine, but he chose to stay in Gerar. Historically, we know there were 6 big famines in Egypt in the 17th and early 18th century. And in fact, one of those famines in 1784, we think was formed by that eruption I talked about in Iceland at the beginning, in Laki, because it sent ash right over this far to Egypt, and it stunted the growth that year. So famines were very common in Egypt, and the one that Joseph was in was just part of that sequence in a way. And the Bible just takes it as a given. It doesn't have a long discussion of why there was a famine. It just says there was a famine. And there's some things you can tease out of the way the Bible writers report these things. And with Joseph, there's this really interesting thing that eventually his brothers come, eventually they realize who it is that's giving them food, and they think they're going to be in real trouble now because they'd actually tried to kill him, and it was only the older brother that said, no, don't kill him, put him down that well. And then providentially, the camel traders had come along and they'd sold him to the camel traders and probably made a buck as well. And then you remember they took his coat back to his dad and said, sorry, he got killed by a wild animal, they'd smeared some blood on it. So I think his brothers probably thought they were really in for it now. But this is what Joseph said. He said, and now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life, he said. Now, a really interesting thing about this is that this isn't said just once. We'll see it, as I show you, said 3 times. And I was always told when I started teaching, you should tell them what you're going to tell them, then tell them what you've told them. Then there's a chance they'll remember it. We read this 3 times. A few verses later, there's another interaction with the brothers. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are 5 more years in which there will be neither ploughing nor harvest. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to keep alive for you many survivors. And again, a few verses later, so it was not you who sent me here, says Joseph, but God. And then eventually their dad dies, and they probably think, well, he was only being nice to us because dad was still alive. And this is what he says right at the end of Genesis 50. It's what Joseph said to his brothers. He said to them, as for you, you meant evil against me. Right? You really did mean evil against me. There's no doubt about that. But God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. And this is sort of part of the mystery, the unfathomableness, isn't it? That God is sovereign even over evil actions. And you actually see that in many other places in the Bible too. And here is God using evil actions, and they really were human evil actions, ultimately to bring about good. And Joseph could see that, which is remarkable, really, isn't it? Because he'd suffered decades because of that. And that's just one of the things I think that we probably need to grapple with. It's not a black and white thing. Evil is certainly evil, but God is just, and God can even use evil for good ends. One of the nice little stories is Naomi and Elimelech. In the early 11th century BC, you can read about this in the book of Ruth, they went to Moab to escape a famine at home. And so their children marry local Moabitess women. So these were not Israelites, they're not God's people. But then the sons die, Elimelech dies, and one of the beautiful passages of the Bible is how Naomi wants to return to her own land, to Israel, and Ruth says, where you go, I will go, and I'll be with you. Even though she was going to a foreign land for her because she was a Moabitess. And one of the lovely things about it is, you remember she marries Boaz, who's a sort of kinsman redeemer. And actually, Ruth becomes an ancestor of Jesus. She's in the genealogy of Jesus, ultimately. This foreigner from outside the promised people. All as a result of a famine. Or you could say that played a part in it. There's other detailed descriptions of famines. In 2 Kings, there's one from a siege. Often sieges were used as a military tactic. You'd just starve people out. In that case, it was so severe that apparently some of the Israelites in the city resorted to cannibalism. And then as you come to the New Testament, you remember in Acts 11, there was a famine right across the Roman world that had been prophesied by Agabus. And Christians in Antioch made a collection which they sent to Jerusalem with Paul and Barnabas. So here's one of the first cases where instead of the central Jewish community that had converted reaching out, here were the converted strangers, the foreigners, which were sending aid back into Jerusalem here. And this famine in 44 to 48 is widely attested to by other secular writers, Josephus and Tacitus, amongst others. And I think it's very striking that when you read about the new creation, which maybe we'll hear more about from Jonathan, because he's done a lot of research on this. Are you going to talk about new creation? I hope so. I hope so. Because one of the striking things in Revelation 7, in God's new creation, never again will people hunger, never again will they thirst. And so, famines were widely known and felt by people, and that's one of the joys of the new creation. This is one of those things that will be no longer, along with death and mourning and crying and pain. And so the last little comment I want to make from how people in the Bible saw disasters was a comment Jesus made when a tower fell down in Siloam and killed 18 people. Because people wanted to know whose fault is it that they died. Were they particularly sinful people? Or maybe it wasn't their fathers who were particularly sinful. Is this why they died? And it's a sort of root reaction that even today people sort of have. Those people died because they must have been worse than me. It must be their fault in some way. And as so often, there's a report in Luke 13, Jesus didn't answer that question. He answered a much more important one at sort of 90 degrees to it. He says, do you think that they were worse offenders than all the others who lived in Jerusalem? No, I tell you, but unless you repent, you will all likewise perish. In other words, we're all going to die. And Jesus was saying more important than when you die is whether you die in a right relationship, whether you've repented, died in a right relationship with God, which is what you're made for. Now, quite likely this was an earthquake that caused it to fall down, quite possibly. But actually, he says, just the 2 previous verses, he says exactly the same answer to something that was a human-caused massacre. They were asking Jesus about some Galileans whose blood Pilate had mixed with their sacrifices. There had been a massacre by the governing authorities of some Galileans. And Jesus said exactly the same thing. Do you think that these Galileans were worse sinners than all the other Galileans because they suffered in this way? I tell you no. But unless you repent, you too will all perish. And I think it's a really interesting insight, isn't it, that Jesus is giving, using disasters as a sort of peg on which to hang this. And I think disasters do this, actually. They do bring you up short, particularly if you're close to it in any way, and make you sort of reconsider your priorities and what is important in life. And that's what Jesus was saying. The most important thing is to be right with God. So the last thing I want to say is when Paul talks about disasters, he knows what he's talking about. This is a list he gives in 2 Corinthians, writing to them. He says, 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and a day in the open sea. I've been in danger from rivers, in danger at sea. I've known hunger and thirst. I've often gone without food. I've been cold and naked. As we talked about just now, he survived an earthquake in Philippi. And we could add others to that. Do you remember people were trying to kill him? He had to be lowered down in a basket outside the city wall to escape from them. So he knew what disasters were. This is somebody who's experienced them. He's not talking from a theoretical viewpoint. And yet this is what he says, which is remarkable, isn't it? I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. For the creation waits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. And he goes on to say, we know that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. In other words, there's something out of kilter with this creation now. It's not how it's meant to be. Human sinfulness is certainly playing its part in that. And yet, it will be right in the fullness of time. And I think that's a hope which Christians have, which is very profound and very motivating as well.